The air inside the medical bay reeked of antiseptic mist and ozone discharge. Fluorescent panels buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile blue hue over everything. On the central bio-suspension table, Franklin Everett lay strapped down, groaning as another wave of pain rolled through his ribs. His left leg was immobilized in a thick gel cast, and his right arm was suspended by a trio of magneto support rings. A semi-transparent dome hovered over his chest, scanning and recording every micro-movement of his broken ribs. His face was pale and glistening with sweat. "Franklin Everett, you have sustained multiple traumas," said the medic, a tall, amphibious-looking alien with translucent skin and 5 independently moving eyes. He wore a translator disc clipped to his neck. "Your injuries include 3 broken ribs, a fractured fibula, and significant soft tissue bruising. You must not stand or apply weight for at least 4 standard Earth weeks." Frank gritted his teeth, chest rising and falling unevenly. "I'm aware. I was there. The medic's primary eye focused on him. This is not sarcasm-appropriate context. Your physiology is fragile. We have stabilized you, but if you leave prematurely, internal bleeding could resume. Our regeneration gel is incompatible with your species' cellular profile, so healing must occur naturally." Frank shifted slightly and grimaced. "Right? No green magic goo then." For weeks, the medic repeated. "Minimum. Strict rest protocol. No exertion. This includes employment tasks." Frank closed his eyes, nodding faintly. 20 hours later, the security checkpoint at the main entrance of the orbital engineering dock buzzed as Frank tapped his ID badge. The gate hesitated. "Authorization denied," the terminal announced. Frank sighed. He leaned against the wall, resting most of his weight on his good leg. "Override. Everett, Franklin. Maintenance Division. Emergency clearance level 2. "Clearance accepted," the terminal replied after a pause. The gate slid open. Inside, the smell of Kolan and molten alloy hit him instantly. Sparks rained from a suspended hull section where a welding drone hovered mid-task. The enormous underbelly of a freighter loomed above, suspended by grav clamps. Frank limped toward his workstation, dragging a light tool trolley behind him with his good hand. "You're out of your mind," said a voice to his left. Burke, a short, stocky man with grease-streaked coveralls and a permanent squint, stood there holding a hydro spanner. "They said your leg was broken." "Fractured," Frank corrected, lowering himself slowly onto a rolling stool. "Not snapped. I can still move it." Burke looked at him like he was trying to figure out if he was joking. "You were in medbay less than a day ago. The alien doc said you were out for a month." Frank pulled a diagnostic tablet from his vest and activated the hull integrity schematics. "I've got a backlog of heat shield recalibrations on Deck G, a coolant leak in the waste duct on C, and the freighter above us needs a full magnetic plate realignment before departure. You think I'm gonna sit in a bed while all that stacks up?" Burke shook his head. "You're gonna collapse." Frank winced as he leaned forward. "Then bring a chair." By noon, Frank had completed 2 diagnostic cycles and had maneuvered under the freighter to inspect the misaligned plate. He was drenched in sweat, his shirt clinging to him. Every breath hurt. His leg throbbed, but he kept his jaw clenched and his movements economical. He was halfway through recalibrating the magnetic coupler when the floor beneath him trembled. The freighter's grav clamps shifted with a metallic groan. A warning siren chirped 3 times. Frank's eyes widened. He pushed off the floor with his good foot, rolling to the side just as a panel dropped from overhead. It slammed into the deck where he had been lying seconds ago. He grunted in pain, the jolt sending a shock through his injured ribs. "Frank!" Burke's voice echoed down the corridor. "You okay?" Frank coughed, holding his side. "Define okay." Burke ran over, crouching beside him. "You're out of your mind. You could have been crushed." "Wasn't," Frank replied, wheezing slightly. "The clamp's secondary lock is degrading. It needs a manual reset." "You're not resetting anything." "I'm calling the medic." Frank didn't argue. He couldn't. He was too busy trying not to pass out. Back in the medical bay, the alien medic loomed over him, eyes narrowed in a way that looked almost accusatory. You returned to the work site despite explicit instruction, he said flatly. Frank lay slumped on the observation bed, hooked to a saline drip. His leg was now elevated, wrapped tightly, and his ribs were once again scanned under the dome. I had to, Frank said hoarsely. We're short-staffed, and the freighter's deadline. The freighter is not your responsibility when your body is in collapse, the medic interrupted. You risked refracturing the fibula and you have torn intercostal tissue near the rib cage. Your internal metrics show elevated lactic acid, stress peptides, and dehydration. This is not resilience. This is recklessness. Frank looked away. I didn't want to fall behind. The medic paused. You are not a machine, Franklin Everett. Your workplace requires functioning personnel, not shattered ones. Frank chuckled despite the pain. You'd be surprised how often those overlap. 3 days passed. Frank stayed in med bay this time, partially because the medic had reported him to Station Command, who had revoked his clearance temporarily. He spent the time reviewing maintenance reports on a tablet, occasionally answering queries from junior techs via voice comms. His condition stabilized and the swelling in his leg reduced. The medic, whose name translated loosely to Kolan, checked in every few hours. On the 4th day, Kolan approached with a different tone. Your body is healing within projections, Kolan said. But recovery is incomplete. You must remain inactive for 12 more Earth days. Frank nodded slowly. I understand, he said. Kolan blinked all 5 eyes in sequence. You say this, but your species has a cultural tendency toward behavior that contradicts verbal acknowledgement of limitation. Frank shrugged. We call it stubbornness. No, it is self-destructive loyalty. On day 5, an emergency alert blared through the station. A coolant main had ruptured near the environmental control hub and a fire had broken out. Frank was still in the medbay, leg braced and arm in a sling. Kolan moved toward the exit. Evacuation protocol is engaged. Remain here. This section is shielded. Frank sat up. The coolant system runs through the central manifold. If it overheats, the oxygen converters could fail. Personnel are already responding, Kolan said. They don't know the emergency bypass route, Frank countered. It was rerouted last cycle. I did the update myself. Kolan hesitated. I can guide them, Frank continued. I won't run. I'll take the lift and use the intercom. After a tense pause, Kolan gave a slight nod. Frank reached the control station near the affected zone, limping and clutching the wall for support. Smoke curled around the ceiling sensors. He activated the emergency intercom. Listen up, his voice crackled through the system. The coolant manifold was rerouted last cycle. If you try to shut it down from the primary panel, it'll loop the coolant back into the intake and trigger a pressure surge. A junior technician's voice came back. Where's the bypass? Subpanel D13. Behind the secondary vent shaft. Remove the casing and pull the red switch, then the yellow. In that order. There was silence. Then a loud hiss through the intercom. The fire suppression system activated. Frank slumped against the wall, coughing. Back in medbay hours later, Kolan stood over him again. You are difficult, Kolan said. Frank gave a weak grin. But effective? Kolan didn't respond. Instead, it adjusted the dome scanner and applied a new gel wrap to Frank's ribs. You have extended your recovery time by 6 days, Kolan said. Frank sighed. Better than losing the oxygen converters. Kolan tilted his head. There is a pattern in your behavior. You recover, then strain yourself until you regress. Why? Frank looked at the ceiling. Because if I don't, someone else gets hurt. Or something gets missed. I'm not trying to be a hero, Kolan. I know the system. I know what breaks and when. If I'm not there, I can't fix it. And no one else knows these old circuits like I do. Kolan was quiet for a long moment. You are flawed, he said finally. But your flaw is symbiotic with your function. I will recommend that your workstation be reassigned closer to medbay during recovery. If you insist on working, you will do so from a place where observation is possible. Frank blinked. That was unexpected. Better compromise than corpse, Kolan said. Frank laughed, then winced. Still hurts when I laugh. Good. Pain is teacher. By the end of the third week, Frank's leg had regained enough strength for light movement. His ribs were still tender, but he could breathe without pain. A modified workstation was installed just outside medbay, allowing him to run diagnostics and coordinate repairs remotely. Burke visited often, bringing updates and the occasional sandwich. Kolan kept him under tight observation but had stopped objecting to his involvement. You are not well, Kolan would remind him. I'm better, Frank would reply. And this time he meant it. By the 7th day, Frank had grown used to the modified workstation outside medbay. It wasn't glamorous, an old diagnostics console propped on a wheeled cart, 2 monitors that hummed unevenly, and a stool that leaned slightly to the left, but it kept him close enough for Kolan to monitor his vitals without needing to nag every hour. The stool creaked under him as he adjusted his position again. His leg brace itched beneath his pants, and his ribs protested each time he leaned forward to tap a command. The environmental systems were still acting up across multiple decks. He flagged a moisture sensor anomaly in Deck 12, logged a flickering lighting junction in the docking corridor, and began rerouting a diagnostic sweep to isolate the voltage flux. A shadow passed over his screen. You are perspiring excessively, Kolan said from behind him, antennae lifting slightly as if sniffing the air, though Frank wasn't sure if that was actually possible. Fluid loss rate has increased by 13% in the last hour. Cease your activity or I will initiate containment. Frank didn't look up. Containment sounds dramatic for a guy monitoring humidity sensors. You are not an engineer. You are an injured patient violating recovery guidelines. I'm seated. I'm not lifting anything. I'm not even standing. You are exhibiting stress responses. Your heart rate is elevated. I'm caffeinated, Frank said, pushing a line of code across the monitor. It's a feature, not a bug. Kolan's secondary eyes narrowed while the central one dilated faintly. We do not understand that idiom, but your sarcasm is not a viable defense against cardiovascular strain. Frank gave a short huff and rubbed his forehead. I'll take a break in 10 minutes. 3, Kolan replied and turned away. Frank muttered something under his breath, then resumed the diagnostic. The console pinged. He froze. The coolant pressure in one of the secondary conduits near the life support junction had just spiked by 30%. He reran the test. Same result. That conduit had been cleared 2 days ago, he remembered, because the technician had accidentally tripped the safety valve and flooded the corridor with vapor. Frank stood up too fast. The stool tipped, clattered to the floor. Kolan's head whipped around. Sit down. There's a buildup in conduit B7. It's climbing fast. If it ruptures, the decompression could wipe out half the oxygen buffer. You are not cleared to move. I'm not asking for a field trip. I need access to the emergency loop interface. Kolan stepped forward, blocking him with 2 elongated limbs. You are not permitted to leave medbay perimeter. I'm not leaving. I'm rerouting from the secondary panel. It's 12 feet that way. Frank pointed down the corridor. No stairs, no weight bearing. I'll crawl if I have to. Kolan hesitated. His antennae twitched in what Frank had come to interpret as reluctant calculation. 5 minutes, Kolan said. You will wear the vitals harness and remain in visual range. Frank already had the panel cover off before Kolan finished speaking. He crouched, biting back a groan as his ribs flared. The hatch opened to reveal the manual override array. He keyed in his access code, bypassed the automated lockout, and rerouted the pressure relief valve from the compromised conduit to the backup buffer. A low hiss echoed through the deck as the system equalized. The pressure reading dropped. Frank exhaled. Kolan hovered behind him the whole time, one appendage holding a bioscanner trained on Frank's back. You have strained your lower spine and shifted rib plate 3 millimeters, Kolan said. This is not progress. Frank stood slowly, resting against the wall. But the buffer's intact. Your definition of success warrants clinical review. Your definition of rest includes letting half the deck suffocate. Kolan made a low clicking sound that Frank had learned meant frustration. You require assisted mobility. If you continue to disregard protocol, I will request limb immobilization. Frank looked horrified. You mean like a cast? I mean like a restraint. Okay, Frank held up his hand. I'll sit. Happy? No. But temporarily compliant. 2 days later, a delegation arrived from the Talthari Council, a species known for their ceremonial excess and exaggerated caution. Their lead envoy wore what looked like a curtain rod fused to a chandelier and was flanked by 2 aides carrying small hygiene fans. Frank watched the procession from his workstation, trying not to laugh. Kolan stood at the back of the room, arms folded not in disapproval, but something close to dread. They are here to inspect environmental safety measures, Kolan said under his breath. Frank blinked. You mean the guys dressed like antique furniture? They are highly influential. Do not speak to them. One of the aides caught sight of Frank and approached. He appears unwell, the aide said, voice filtered through a translator with a faint musical lilt. Is he contagious? Kolan stepped in. He is recovering from injury. He is not infectious. The aide tilted its head. Then why is he outside medical confinement? Frank shrugged. Because the air filters won't fix themselves. The aide recoiled. You permit this individual to engage in technical duties while visibly damaged? Frank stood slowly. I'm damaged, sure. But I'm also the reason the oxygen systems didn't collapse 3 days ago. The envoy turned, the beaded trim on his headdress shimmering. This is the human, he said. The one who resumed labor within a rotation of internal trauma. Frank gave a half-hearted wave. Guilty. The envoy studied him, then turned to Kolan. You allow this? No, Kolan said flatly. He allows himself. The envoy stepped closer to Frank, who instinctively straightened, then winced. Most species would be incapacitated for weeks. You continue under duress. Why? Frank rubbed the back of his neck. Because things break faster than they get fixed. And people depend on those things not breaking. The envoy seemed genuinely perplexed. But the body is finite. Self-preservation should override duty. Not when the alternative is watching others pay the price. The envoy looked him up and down, then turned to Kolan. You must study them further. There is something unnatural in their capacity for motion during harm. It is either madness or evolution. Kolan didn't respond. Later that night, long after the Talthari delegation had left, Kolan stood beside Frank as he ran another calibration pass. You have been granted temporary workstation clearance within the medbay perimeter, Kolan said. But you will submit to monitoring 3 times per cycle. If any index crosses threshold, your clearance is revoked. Frank nodded, eyes on the screen. Deal. You will not leave perimeter again. Unless something catches fire. Kolan's antennae twitched. That was not a humorous statement. Wasn't trying to be funny. Kolan placed a small container beside Frank's console. Inside were nutrient bars, electrolyte packets, and a folded hydration sheet. You forget to eat, Kolan said. Frank picked one up and raised an eyebrow. You're feeding me now? You were less useful when unconscious. Frank snorted. You're warming up to me. You were mistaken. The lights dimmed slightly as the station entered night cycle. Frank leaned back, resting his brace gently against the desk. Kolan remained nearby, silent for once. Frank stared at the screen, the diagnostic scrolling past. You ever get used to this? He asked. To what? Fixing everything just enough to keep it running. Knowing it's all held together by duct tape and luck. Kolan regarded him. We do not use tape. Or luck. Yeah, Frank said quietly. That's the difference. The ventilation unit above the medbay workstation had begun to rattle again. It wasn't loud, just a persistent, metallic tremor that tickled the edge of attention like a mosquito in a quiet room. Frank leaned back in the reinforced chair Kolan had specially requisitioned for him, craning his neck toward the ceiling with mild irritation. That vent's loose again, he said, pointing upward without much enthusiasm. Panels vibrating against the frame. Kolan didn't pause in his exam. He was running a slow, deliberate wand over Frank's torso, checking bone density along his healing ribs. The scanner emitted a thin green beam that shimmered faintly as it passed. You are not assigned to ceiling maintenance. Ignore it. I can't ignore it. It's going to rattle itself free and drop into the middle of my console during a systems update. You will not be performing systems updates without supervision, Kolan said, adjusting the scan angle. You lost blood volume last cycle. Your marrow production is still below baseline. That is not compatible with unsupervised diagnostics. Frank exhaled through his nose and tried not to shift. His torso itched under the sensor gel and his shoulder brace was pinching near the collarbone. Didn't lose that much blood. Barely a pint. For your mass, it was significant. Combined with your electrolyte deficiency and previous exertion, you are functioning at 73%. I've done worse with 60, Frank muttered. Kolan tapped the wand twice against the scanner console and made no reply. The silence stretched. The flickering lights on the equipment blinked in their usual rhythm, interrupted only by the occasional beep from the vitals monitor. Outside the medbay, the faint hum of the station's main corridor drifted in, along with the low whoosh of passing grav carts. You ever get tired of watching me almost die? Frank asked. Kolan blinked both lateral eyes, then turned slightly. I am tasked with preventing that outcome. Watching you attempt it repeatedly is merely exhausting. Frank gave a dry laugh. You'd make a great ER nurse back on Earth. I am not familiar with that role. Emergency response. People like you, but with less limbs and more shouting. Kolan lowered the scanner. Perhaps shouting would be more effective in your case. Wouldn't hurt to try. Nothing else seems to work. Kolan walked to the terminal and began uploading the scan data. His movements were fluid, almost too careful, as if every gesture had been practiced 1,000 times. I have submitted your recovery metrics to central records. You are eligible for partial duty non-physical, limited to seated tasks with oversight. You will not lift, repair, or relocate any object heavier than 1 kilogram. Frank raised an eyebrow. 1 kilogram? That's barely a coffee mug. Correct. You are not to lift coffee mugs either. I'm going to ignore that last part. And I will file the violation. Frank rubbed his temple. You really don't let a guy bend the rules, do you? Bending rules is how you arrived here with fractured ribs and misplaced bone alignment. They weren't misplaced, just slightly out of agreement with the rest of my skeleton. Kolan turned, antennae bristling faintly. You were found beneath a freighter with a dislocated shoulder and impact trauma to your lower extremity, which I survived. Human survival is neither a justification for recklessness nor a replacement for common sense. Frank leaned back again and sighed. You ever talk to the station commander? About how short-handed we are. I have spoken with the commander. She has instructed the repair schedule be modified to accommodate your limitations. That's not going to fly. We've got a Taltheri diplomat returning in 4 days, and the docking clamps on Bay 6 are still misaligned. That's a 3-person job minimum, and the drone arms are still out of calibration. You are not one of those 3 people. No. But I'm the only one who knows how to reprogram the clamps control node without triggering a full reset. Kolan didn't respond immediately. He returned to the scanner, adjusted something on the panel, then folded his upper limbs together. Your body is healing. Barely. But your threshold for pain tolerance is not the same as your threshold for structural integrity. You could appear functional and still suffer internal regression. I know, Frank said. But I also know that if those clamps fail during docking, we're looking at hull damage, maybe decompression. You can't fix that with rest. You cannot fix it at all if you collapse again. I won't. You've said that before. Frank stood, slowly watching for Kolan's reaction. The medic didn't stop him. He took it as a minor victory. Let me show you something, he said. Kolan followed him out of the medbay. They moved slowly, Frank favoring his left leg without limping. The corridor was quiet, lit by the soft glow of overhead panels. When they reached the auxiliary control room, Frank keyed in a code and stepped inside. The room housed a cluster of terminals, each displaying real-time diagnostics of critical systems. Power flow, docking protocols, environmental control all mapped in shifting graphs and data feeds. Frank gestured to a highlighted section on the screen. This is the real-time alignment variance on Bay 6 clamps. See those spikes every third cycle? That's from a feedback delay in the lateral actuator. The drone arms can't compensate because they're still running the pre-update firmware. Kolan stepped closer, examining the readout. Why has this not been corrected? Because the firmware patch requires a manual tether sync to the drone core. It's supposed to be a 2-hour job, but the last guy who tried it got locked out of the system. I'm the only one who's done it without bricking the controller. Kolan's eyes adjusted in size. A sign Frank had learned meant deep processing. You are proposing to perform this task yourself? No. I'm proposing to guide the crew through it from here. I'll write the patch, monitor the sync, and walk them through the steps in real time. I won't touch a thing. I'll sit in a chair and type. Kolan looked at him for a long moment. You will remain seated. Like a statue. No standing. You're the one who said I couldn't lift a coffee mug. My respect for your thresholds is absolute. Kolan made a low, noncommittal noise. You will hydrate every hour, he added. Frank gave a small nod. Deal. Later that day, with a thermal wrap around his side and a hydration pack slung over the back of his chair, Frank sat in the auxiliary control room and guided the repair team through the drone sync. Through the headset, he could hear the crew grumbling, misreading steps, getting impatient with the interface. He corrected them calmly, rewording instructions when needed, never raising his voice. The patch uploaded cleanly. The clamps responded instantly. The variance dropped to below threshold. The crew cheered over the line. Someone shouted Frank's name. He muted the channel and leaned back, exhaling slowly. Kolan stepped into the room, glanced at the screen, then at Frank. You remained seated, not even tempted. You are flushed. It's warm in here. You are perspiring. It's still warm. Kolan handed him a chilled compress. Apply this before I decide you've earned another week of bed confinement. Frank pressed it to his neck and closed his eyes. I didn't move a muscle, he said. You moved several, but none critically. Frank cracked one eye open. Progress. Barely. Frank smiled anyway. That evening, Kolan adjusted the medbay roster. Frank's workstation was moved permanently into the auxiliary room, outfitted with additional monitoring. The station commander authorized a new policy. Human personnel would require dual medical and operations clearance before returning to physical duty after injury. Kolan began updating the medical logs with revised human recovery protocols, noting with quiet frustration that none of them could account for willpower as a variable. Frank finished his shift and returned to the medbay. He didn't argue when Kolan handed him a protein infusion packet and set the chair to recline. I'm not planning to die in your care, Frank said. Kolan didn't look up. That would be inefficient. Frank laughed softly. You know, I think we're finally starting to understand each other. No, Kolan said, but I am adapting. Frank reclined a little further, the stiffness in his ribs easing with the angle. The lights dimmed as the station shifted into rest cycle. For once, the ventilation unit didn't rattle. Everything held.